Well, I wrote it really as a business book, but it's got a lot of personal in it and a lot on relationship. And the business book is how to become successful, how to come back from adversity, how to handle adversity. And I think it's something that really people want to read, as you can see by what you're seeing right now.
Trump, The Art of the Comeback. The Art of the Prenup. The Engagement Ring. A prenuptial agreement is a terrible, vicious, and ugly document that spells out the terms and conditions of a divorce long before the event itself. Probably the worst thing about a prenuptial agreement is that it becomes, in many cases, a self-fulfilling prophecy. People who have prenups seem predisposed to divorce, and surveys have indicated that this is true. A couple who signs a prenuptial agreement is approximately 50% more likely to divorce than couples who don't. In order to make the statistic look a little bit friendlier, however, it must be pointed out that without a prenuptial agreement, it can be so complicated and financially wrenching to split that many decide it is better to remain being unhappily married than go through the trauma of a divorce. For example, due to the vastness and complexity of my business, it would have taken 10 or 15 years in many courts, states, or perhaps even countries to finalize my decision with either Ivana or Marla. My financial life would have been officially over, and certainly I wouldn't be able to write a book. Many millions would have been paid to lawyers. It would have been ridiculous. In terms of wheeling and dealing, which is essentially my life, I would have been reduced to court orders and litigation. My business would have been in total disarray. During my first divorce, Ivana tried to pull lines on almost all of my properties. At the most critical financial time of my life, if she had succeeded in this, I would have not been able to deal myself out of a very tough financial situation. Rather, I would have to go to her for approval to sell anything. For instance, when I needed to sell my yacht in order to raise cash, or when I sold the Trump shuttle in order to get out of those liabilities, I would have needed her permission. When I made my great deal on the Plaza Hotel, I would have had to go to Ivana, not an easy thing in and of itself, and ask for her approval. This would have been a ludicrous situation for me or anyone else. Certainly at that time in her life, Ivana would not have wanted to see me do well. Therefore, she would have had no real inclination to approve the deal unless I gave her an extraordinary edge. Since I had the prenup, the court wiped out the lens as soon as they were filed. In deciding to write about prenuptial agreements, I was faced with the dilemma of where to fit the subject in this book. Do I put it under women in my life, ingredients for success, or just give it its own chapter? I decided to do the separate chapter because it covers all of the territory. It certainly covers marriage and women, but it also has a lot to do with the ingredients for success, and perhaps even more so, the ingredients to making a financial comeback. My comeback would have been totally impossible had I not fully executed and well-drawn prenuptial agreements with both Ivana and Marla. The great thing about a prenuptial agreement is that you go into it with all sides properly protected by competent counsel. Everybody signs it, happy or not. Then an extraordinary thing happens. You split up, and the women try to act like they didn't know what they were doing when they signed the document. Witness Ivana, a very sophisticated person, fighting long and hard in her claim that she didn't speak English well enough to understand what she was signing. Marla's case will be interesting and will tell me a lot about her. This book is being written at a very delicate time in my relationship with Marla. Many lawyers are circling her in order to gain fame and fortune. They're trying to convince her to protest our agreement. I have already been contacted by Robert Cohen, one of Ivana's former lawyers. He's a decent guy. Let's see where he takes Marla. Money's being placed on both sides of the betting table as to whether or not she'll fight our prenup. By the time this book is out, we will probably have the answer. In order to protect myself against a legal battle, particularly against what Ivana did when I was forced to spend a great deal amount in legal fees in order to win, I took certain precautions. I added a clause to my contract with Marla that states, in effect, that if she protests this prenuptial agreement and loses, she has to pay my legal fees. this will be very substantial. Perhaps even more than the amount I'd be paying her. For all the people who have read this book, I hope you enjoy watching. I won't. Remember, it is only the lawyers who come out on top. The most difficult aspect of the prenuptial agreement is informing your future wife, I love you very much, but just in case things don't work out, this is what you'll get in a divorce. There are basically 3 types of women and reactions. One is the good woman who very much loves her future husband solely for himself, but refuses to sign the agreement on principle. I fully understand this. But the man should take a pass anyway and find someone else. The other is the calculating woman who refuses to sign the prenuptial agreement because she is expecting to take advantage of the poor, unsuspecting sucker she's got in her grasp. There is also the woman who will openly and quickly sign a prenuptial agreement in order to make a quick hit and take the money given to her. I have seen this on 2 occasions. I was surprised, especially having known one of the women, and that these people so openly and quickly negotiated out of a deal and then just as quickly dissolved the marriage. They had a nice clean split and got a fat check for very little work. This must sound awfully sinister to those of you who lead a more normal life than I do, but in my world, this kind of crap happens all the time. People are really vicious, and no place are they more vicious than in their relationships with the opposite sex. The fact is that time moves on and people change. You can be deeply in love when you get married, but a number of years later, you just don't care to spend your life with that person anymore. When you have a prenuptial agreement, you're able to get out of the situation. It is not the end all, and even with a prenup, a separation or divorce is not easy. But without the prenup, the divorce becomes almost impossible with the way laws are written today. There is no question that approaching your future spouse about a prenup is very difficult. I have heard of cases where women break down into total hysteria. I even have heard of a case where a man was ordered to sign one in order to protect the wealth of the woman, and he started crying. Actually, I know the guy in question, and I know how hard he worked to land this particular very wealthy lady. I have no doubt in my mind that he was only crying because her representatives were able to nip his act in the bud, due to the fact that he was to get nothing in case of divorce. He decided to break things off, after working 2.5 years to hit the pay dirt. You have to protect yourself. You never know how the dynamics in a marriage will play out. Marla was always wanting me to spend more time with her. Why can't you be at home at 5 o'clock like other husbands, she would ask. Sometimes when I was in the wrong mood, I would give a very materialistic answer. Look, I like working. You don't mind traveling around in beautiful helicopters and airplanes, and you don't mind living at the top of Trump Tower or at Mar-a-Lago or traveling to the best hotels or shopping in the best stores and never having to worry about money, do you? If you want me to be home at 5 o'clock, maybe these other things wouldn't happen, and you'd be complaining about that too. Why would you want to take something that I enjoy and change it? I've always viewed her wives as being very selfish, but the fact is, in a marriage, both sides have to be happy. If they're not, it's just not going to work. Often I will tell my friends whose wives are constantly nagging them about this, or that they're better off leaving and cutting out their losses. I'm not a great believer in always trying to work things out, because it just doesn't happen that way. For a man to be successful, he needs support at home, just like my father had for my mother, not someone who is always griping and bitching. When a man has to endure a woman who is not supportive and complains constantly about his not being at home enough or he not being attentive enough, he will not be very successful unless he is able to cut the cord. I recently played golf with one of the most brilliant men on Wall Street, the head of Morgan Stanley, John Mack. John is a good friend of mine who is married to a fabulous woman. Christy is totally supportive of the long, hard hours he works. John was telling me that after our game, he was going to see one of his men. This particular man had the potential to be a star at Morgan Stanley, but he was having tremendous difficulty with his wife. She always complained that he was working too hard and too long and wasn't devoting enough time or energy to her. Without any further discussion, I looked at John and said, "Tell the man to lose the wife. There is no hope for that marriage. Tell him if he stays, he'll do a lousy job for you." John looked at me and, being the good family man that he is, disagreed. He thought that everything would work out fine and was looking forward to seeing them both in order to get things back on track. I told John that I didn't want to sound cold or cynical, but I knew the marriage just wasn't going to work. If the woman was inclined this way, she was not going to change. I actually told John to pull the young man aside and tell him that it was me who made the recommendation. If he doesn't lose the ball breaker, his career will go nowhere. I have no doubt that I will be proven right in the long run, but I truly respect John for giving it the old college try. Another example is a friend of mine who is a great golfer. He plays on the Pro Golf Tour and has recently been getting better and better each time he goes out, until recently. Although he is not yet a household name, as a pretty good athlete and golfer myself, I can tell you his potential is tremendous. But he does have one very big problem: his wife. She complains incessantly. Despite living in a beautiful home, in a beautiful community, that he is not home enough to satisfy her needs. She calls him in the middle of a tournament and starts crying that she wants him back now. He explains to her that he is a touring professional, with the word touring strongly emphasized, as he has to travel the country and even the world in order to play golf and bring home money. He explains that he'll have lots of time to be together during the off-season and in the years ahead, but right now he's touring. This never satisfies her. All this strife has put a lot of pressure on him, and in fact his game has gone downhill lately. He called me and asked what he should do, and I told him very simply that he has to make a choice. He could go home and be with his wife and perhaps make her happy. However, he would always harbor a great disgust towards her for not giving him his chance at greatness. In this case, the marriage probably wouldn't work anyway. The other alternative would be to cut her loose. Tell her to find a guy who's going to be better for her than you. She won't find it easy, and the grass will not be greener, I told him. But in my opinion, she's very selfish, and he would do much better without her. Find a woman who is supportive, because there is nothing better than a supportive woman. You've got a chance to do great, I told him, but you'll never be great married to this woman. She'll drive you totally crazy and directly cause your failure at something in which you have tremendous God-given ability. If she wants a husband who's home all the time, let her find somebody else. So far, he hasn't taken my advice, but I predict that he soon will. The other night, I got a call from him saying that she's gotten worse than ever. I could go on forever about the viciousness, the virtues and liabilities of a prenuptial agreement. But in a nutshell, anyone of wealth, especially substantial wealth, and even more important, wealth that's in a complicated business form, should be institutionalized if he or she gets married without one. This book is called The Art of the Comeback, and I know firsthand that you can't come back if you're spending 100% of your time fighting with a spouse for your sanity and financial life. The next chapter will be called The Really Big One, Breaking Ground. Nothing is more unfair or ridiculous than the mindless bureaucracy of New York local government. Red tape, meetings, proposals, amended proposals, environmental impact studies, votes, amended environmental impact studies, more votes, follow-up meetings, ad nauseance. Seriously, the approval process leaves me, and everyone else for that matter, numb. I just want to build. After all, that's what I do best. 10 years! It took me 10 frustrating years to break ground on the West Side Railroad Yards project, compromising Television City, Trump Boulevard, and Riverside South. A wild, almost unbelievable tale spins out over 2 decades. A tale of pointless bureaucracy, failed promises, friendship, betrayal, loyalty, and all ending in victory. We broke ground early this year. The tale of triumph often features strange and colorful characters, and the tale has a moral gleaned by Herbert Muschamp, the wonderful and well-respected architecture critic for the New York Times. In an article about the project in 1996, what does it say about the state of urban policy that it takes such an enormous project, virtually a small city, to fix one subway station? What does it say when it takes a luxury housing developer to create affordable housing? Welcome to the drama of Riverside South. Who knew in 1974, when I first bought the West Side Railroad yards, I sold it and then bought it back a few years later. A 76-acre stretch of undeveloped land right next to the Hudson River. That I'd still be fighting to build it today. It's absurd. Manhattanese are suffocating. There's a desperate demand for housing. Yesterday I picked up the New York Times cover story. Housing shortage will worsen in 1998. I read on. 98% of apartments in New York City are occupied. Rents have never been higher. Even if you can find an apartment, the writer notes, chances are you can't afford it. I look up from the paper. I walk to the window of my penthouse atop Trump Tower, just across the park, flanking the east side of the Hudson River. Sits my enormous piece of land posed for development. For 75 years, developers, some great, some not, have tried to build on this land, and now the process has just begun. My mind drifts back to 1982. I had just repurchased the land from Francisco Marci, a great Argentinian businessman. He had a hard time with the zoning process. You can't really do business in New York if you don't understand New York. Its politics, the people, the pulse. Some of the other developers were so desperate to get approvals that they gave away more than $200 million in concessions. No one, and I mean no one, could make enough money to turn a profit on a deal like that. So when the last round hit the wall, the bank shut them down. I decided to step in with a clean slate. I didn't want to be held accountable for past mistakes, so I threw away the approvals they'd sold their souls to acquire. It was time to design. I developed a plan called Television City, a bold, aggressive blueprint that included the world's tallest building and acres of studio space. At the time, NBC was threatening to move out of Manhattan to somewhere in New Jersey. In typical form, the city government didn't seem all that concerned about losing more than 400,000 jobs. Ed Koch and Company didn't flinch at saying goodbye to $500 million a year in revenues and great prestige. I realize now that it was personal. Ed Koch didn't like me. He may have respected me, but he sure didn't like me. Our relationship went south for one reason: the Woolman Rink in Central Park. You may remember the tale. Local government had been trying for 7 years, and $20 million to get that thing rebuilt. In 1986, I stepped in, and with $2 million, or 10% of the city's dollars. New Yorkers were gliding across the ice 4 months later. Koch was humiliated. He took it personally. Rather than compliment me on saving the Woolman Rink, one of the great bureaucratic disasters in New York City history, Ed Koch tried to make light of my triumph by saying that the city could have done the same thing, that is, build the rink in 4 months rather than in 7 years. If only it were not forced to go through bureaucratic red tape. This was nonsense, and everybody knew it. But nonetheless, Ed's feelings towards me came out loud and clear. He felt I showed him up, and from that point forward, my relationship with Ed Koch was in the pits. I couldn't understand why Koch didn't see NBC's potential move as a crisis. He seemed almost blasé about it. I presented my plan to Koch and asked him as mayor for his support, to help me convince NBC to move to my site. He did the opposite. Koch slammed me at every chance he got, and people began to get wind of it. That summer, the Wall Street Journal ran an editorial article that claimed Koch's irrational behavior was based on ego and, oddly enough, jealousy. Television City was clearly good for New York, and everybody knew it. Not just the editorial writers at the Journal. Koch's pettiness cost the city, a city he'd sworn to serve, in jobs, tax revenues, and housing. I believe in doing things big. I tell my kids, if you're gonna do it, go for it. Make it the biggest, make it the best. The philosophy didn't sit well with the residents of the Upper West Side. They were crawling all over me with mostly perfunctory opposition. They just didn't like the idea of having me in their backyard. Also, keep in mind that a lot of people who sit on these boards and organize these coalitions basically just don't have enough to do. I guess my opposing plan gave them a sense of purpose. They saw power. They wanted some too. Creating a city within a city takes vision. I have vision, and I wanted to use it, not be embroiled in endless controversy and bureaucracy. I'll never forget the day my colleague Norma handed me a letter from Stephen Rockefeller. He must have heard about my travels because it was more of a note of encouragement. He had enclosed an architectural review of Rockefeller Center. Well, it was still on the drawing board back in 1931. Critics called it a weakly conceived romantic chaos that represented the sorest failure of imagination and intelligence in modern American architecture. The letters simply read, "Keep the faith and stay on track, Donald. All the best, Steve." The small group of devout enemies towards my project was led by Madeline Palassi, a community activist of virtually no vision who unfortunately had nothing but time on her hands. She had fought the project long before I had arrived, and had made life difficult for previous developers. I always thought I could have made a deal with her, but a lot would have had to happen, would have had to be sacrificed in the job, and the development would have never been as good as it is today. So I took her on, and despite her lawsuits and howling at every front, she was easy to defeat. Often you appreciate a good fight, and you respect your opponent, but in this case, I really liked grinding her into the ground. The Madeline Palisades of the world are, in my opinion, very bad for New York. They fight people at every turn, hoping for attention. Almost nothing else. The best way to deal with them is to beat them, and that's what I did. It just didn't make sense. Not many people know this, but before the Depression, the rich preferred to live in the newest buildings. New construction created the most desirable housing. For some reason, this attitude changed. Perhaps it's people's obsession with nostalgia. Who knows? Who cares? For me, it's a tremendous hassle. Because when the city requires builders to follow the guidelines of outmodeled styles using outmodeled materials, it strifes architectural expression. So I rolled up my shirt sleeves and prepared for war. I identified my bloodiest battle, the Uniform Land Use Review Process, or ULURP. ULURP is an impossible situation. All applicants are approved by the Board of Estimate, composed of the 5 presidents, the City Council President, and the Comptroller. In order to move from one level to the next in the approval process, from the Community Board to the Borough President to the City Planning Commission and so on, the applicant is forced to negotiate blind, clueless as to the opponent's demands. It's a circus, and it often produces approval packages that are essentially unbuildable. Koch decided to change all this. I was optimistic until I learned of his plan. In his infinite wisdom, Koch created yet another bureaucratic entity, the Charter Revision Commission, and placed Frederick A. Schwartz, heir to the FAO Schwartz fortune, at the helm. To put it bluntly, it was a complete disaster. The process became even more cumbersome, expensive, and time-consuming than ever. I was appalled. Nothing, I had thought, could have ever made this process more inefficient, more ill-conceived. But I was wrong. A cover article in the New York Times co-ed that the FAO Schwartz had turned his attention away from the development to the birds, the bees, the trees, and the toxic dumps. How pathetic. I forged on, hitting wall after wall. Then, just as I was about to bail out, a couple of prominent architects presented a plan to the city called the Civic Alternative. It had the support of the civic groups and the West Side residences. My curiosity was piqued. I decided to snoop around. It was right around Christmas, so I had upteen Christmas parties to attend. I don't really like parties, I like to work. Luckily, during at least one, I was able to do both. I ran into a friend, Stephen Swid, at Kravith, Swain and Moore's annual Christmas cocktail bash. Steve headed up the Municipal Arts Society. I assumed he might have the inside track on the details of the alternative plan. We agreed to meet a few days before Christmas to discuss it. The meeting was tense. I found myself face to face with Bruce Simon of West Pride, the West Side Residents Coalition, Linda Davidoff of the Parks Council, Kent Barwick of the Municipal Arts Society, and other opponents to Riverside South. They presented the plan. I was impressed, particularly with one aspect, the idea of relocating the existing Miller Highway in an arc towards the east, away from the Hudson River. Moving the highway would move up Manhattan to the water, would open up Manhattan to the water. It would create more space for a park. We'd finally have public access to the waterfront. It was a great idea, but not that viable. The city was ready to spend $63 million fixing up the highway, but moving it would cost an extra $100 million at least. I seriously considered embracing the civic alternative and giving up Riverside South. My execs urged me not to quit. Riverside South was only 1 or 2 weeks away from certification. Essentially, I was on my opponent's 8-yard line. It was a tough call. After 5 years and millions of dollars, I was being offered a new team with a better game plan, except I'd be moving the ball back to the 20-yard line, with absolutely no guarantees. It wasn't even a decision between field goal and touchdown. I could end up with nothing. I thought about it for 4 days. I went back to the drawing board. Then I made the decision. If the Civics gave me guarantees, I'd join them. I asked the city for more support. I wanted the administration and the elected officials to back me up. The Civics got me. I didn't surprise anyone as much as I surprised myself. We put together a feisty team. Linda Davidoff, Bruce Simon, Kent Barwick, Richard Anderson of the Regional Plan Association, Francis Barantek of the Natural Resources Defense Council, Peter Wright of the Riverside Park Fund, Richard Kahn of the Urban Development Corporation, and me. Richard Kahn was in charge. That gave me great comfort. I trusted him and respected his ability. He thinks like a businessman, but also has a great vision for the site. Those were long, grueling months after I decided to go with the Civics. I went around Manhattan telling people this was either the dumbest or the smartest decision I'd ever made in business. I was getting into bed with my enemies, but I had found, during our negotiation, that these enemies were in actuality very good people. Many of them had devoted years of their life to specific areas. For example, Linda Davidoff to the parks, and all of them gave me great ideas. Also, these members were highly respected by the politicians. I found that with them, things could get done that a developer would never ask for. The truth is, I am now very glad to admit it. The project would have never been as good without the input given by the Civics. So on March 5th, 1991, my development was really born. Mayor Dinkins and the civic leaders throughout the city held a major news conference at which it was announced that an agreement had been struck with me for agreeing to move the West Side Highway inland, a feat to be paid for by the government. And the city and the 7 leading civic associations within the state of New York would support my project and speed it through the bureaucracy of the New York City zoning process. The West Side of Manhattan, at the insistence of the various civic leaders and groups, was to get a great 30-acre park fronting the Hudson River, and I was to get speed and certainty of approval. It sounded like a good deal to me, but interestingly, in the end, the Civics were hurt badly by a small group of political leaders headed by Jerry Nadler, the local congressman who fought against the funding for the highway after the money had been virtually obtained. The end result was that I got my zoning in rapid fashion. And the Civics and the West Side residents did not get their park, for which they'd fought so hard and so long. Well, this was good for me. It was extremely unfair to them. Sometimes I can't believe it. My deal, negotiated, done, and with the Civics no less. I hadn't made my usual slew of enemies. We'd made a few compromises, but nothing major. 9 million square feet of space, 5,600 apartments. We assured West Side residences with the design guidelines to ensure compatibility between Riverside South and the surrounding neighborhoods. I agreed to manage the public parks if it were approved. It was the largest single development ever undertaken by the private sector in New York City, the largest job ever approved by the New York City Planning Commission. We'd won. And we got great feedback. Paul Goldberger of the New York Times wrote, "Riverside South is right. It is intelligently tied in to the existing city, yet it holds the promise of being a very special, unique place." Governor Cuomo, who had backed us all along, renewed his commitment. Mayor Dickens was behind us. Almost everyone was behind us. In fact, other than a small band of people such as Jerry Nadler and some of the local politicians. One of the most interesting stories I tell, one that sheds a lot of light on the New York City politics at the time, is that during the early years of the development, I gave political support to Jerry Nadler. No deals were made, but nonetheless, I was his supporter. Amazingly, during this time, he never once opposed the job, even when I was proposing the world's tallest building. When things got tight for me in the early 1990s and I stopped supporting him only because I didn't have the time, patience, and didn't want to waste the money, he became my opponent. And not just an opponent in general, he became an opponent of Riverside South, the civic alternative, a much more popular plan than anything previously proposed on the site. Interesting how politics work, isn't it? If I support him, he likes 100-story buildings. If I don't, he fights me on something that everybody wants. In truth, Nadler was neither for nor against the highway. He just wanted to derail my project. What he didn't realize that was he was making it much less expensive for me to build. Now that the job has started, the Upper West Side is extremely angry with Congressman Nadler because I got my job and they didn't want their park. They didn't get their park. On May 18th, 1992, 14 months after our announcement, we were ready to begin the 7 months of formal public review, the last stand, and it was a battle. Upper West Side residents are notoriously and loudly active politically. They felt betrayed that the Civics had joined me. Then City Council President Andrew Stein pulled the rug out from under me. I'll get to that later. Everyone seemed to be overlooking the obvious, most crucial point, economics. At the time, unemployment in New York had hit 11.5%. Construction was at a virtual standstill. Riverside South had the potential to create 50,000 construction jobs and well over 5,000 permanent jobs, not to mention the added tax dollars. Dinkins and Cuomo got that. The editorial writers of the New York Post got it. The editorial read, "Today blocking development for reasons devoid of logic seems downhill, downright suicidal. Donald Trump has gone well beyond halfway in an effort to satisfy his foes." So I'd gotten the support of some of the media. I went after labor. I set up a meeting of New York's major union leaders. To build support, 10,000 construction workers marched on City Hall, demanding the approval of Trump City. Eddie Mallory and the heads of various construction unions were terrific in their push for more jobs. Despite the support, the community board voted 35-1 against the plan. No surprise, I realized I had to take on and eventually woo Ruth Messenger. I had a great deal of respect for Ruth. Manhattan Borough president. Her life got to be hell. Every day she deals with guiding people through the considerations of public policy, vicious political ambitions, the settling of old scores, and endless politicking. It's worthy of a Jack Lee Collins novel. A hopeful mayor has cast aside his longtime friend in search of votes. Borough presidents ceasefully vow to protect their home turf. A well-known socialite and another office trade passionate charges of selling out and caving in. Queens is worried about the proposed television studio competing with Silvercup Studios in Astoria. The Bronx won $7 million it was promised under a previous plan for the site, and Brooklyn seems to want to pay Ruth back for an earlier vote against the development. My strategy with Ruth: kill her with kindness, in the form of affordable housing. I welcome the chance to open up Riverside South to more people. Messenger suggested making 20% of the housing units affordable, with no government assistance. A minimum of 12% of affordable housing would be required, 6% low income, 3% moderate income, and 3% middle income. Some of the demands were unreasonable. For instance, the city asked me to foot the whole bill for repairs on the 77th to 72nd Street subway station. $35 million. I said forget it. Once we had Ruth Messenger's vote, we were ready for the ULURP endgame. We turned up the heat. I had to please the commission and the council without committing to an unbuildable project. In the end, I agreed to reduce the size of the development from 8.3 million to 7.9 million square feet. I also pledged to give the Metropolitan Transit Authority $5 million. That was it. The Planning Commission approved us, 12-0. Frankly, I was surprised by the unanimous vote. First, it's exceedingly rare, even on the rosiest of projects. Second, I had a few loud opponents. Then Borough President Andrew Stein and a well-known socialite, Amanda Burden. Stein and I had been friends for 15 years. I contributed hundreds of thousands of dollars to his campaigns. I never once asked for favors. He offered. "I'll always support you," he said. "Don't you worry about a thing, Donnie. It's ironic. I never, not once, asked Andy for a favor. And when I needed him most, he let me down." I found out he fired off a letter to Richard Schaefer of the City Planning Commission, stating his opposition to Riverside South. It gets worse. The guy then took a poll of West Side residents. How do they feel about Riverside South? If he backed the project, would they vote for him or not? Obviously, nabbing a few votes on the Upper West Side was more important to him than keeping my friendship. I know he has major regrets. While I can never forgive Andy for his lack of loyalty, he's actually a good guy. His father, Jerry Finkelstein, is one of the great characters in New York. He's as solid as a rock and a true friend. Andy's brother Jimmy runs the New York Law Journal and has always done an outstanding job. Andy, however, was under a lot of great pressure at the time, and pressures make politics. He was running for mayor, and in all honesty, could not afford to alienate the West Side by voting for a Trump project. In the end, Andy got some very bad advice, and he took it. I believe he wishes he had not. I believe he wishes he had gone the other way. It's pointless to create a project of this scope and go through with it if it doesn't stimulate the economy. The construction industry in New York City was in a severe state of depression. New residential permits dropped from 12,079 in 1985 to 756 in 1989. One private office tower was under construction. I passionately wanted to turn it around. Riverside South will pump $2.5 billion into the economy over a 5-year period. What more could I do for the city I adore? Finally, after all the years and all the politicking, victory was at hand. The New York City Council voted 42 to 8 to approve the zoning on my job. Wonderful comments were made by almost all about the beauty and potential of this job. Accolades were thrown in every direction about how civic groups were able to come together and unite with a developer to build something that was appealing, reasonable, and proper. Unlike the Coliseum project and many other halted projects that were litigated for years, this was a case where everyone came together. Richard Kahn, Dinkins, the civic leaders, and I all hoped that this would be used in the future as a yardstick for other development projects. I had my vote, and I had my zoning, and now I could look for financing and partners. Before the zoning came through, of course, no one was interested. Now everyone wanted to join with me. I had a suspicion I'd be taken to court by a few West Side residences, so when I was, there was no surprise. When a highly respected New York City Supreme Court Justice saw that the civics had teamed up with me, he saw how ludicrous the suit was. Seldom, he said, if ever, had he seen a developer joined by those people who were almost always on the other side of the equation. He immediately knew. He immediately threw the case out of the court. In the most uncanny way, the Riverside South project follows the rule I try to live by. Get your zoning in a bad economic climate and begin building in a good one. I got a little lucky. There could have been no worse climate than in the early 1990s. When I got my zoning, frankly, I'm not sure that the zoning on this site would have been possible in good or even normal times. It was the only depressed state of New York and the country in general that allowed me to get what I wanted, the best deal possible. As for always building in a booming economic climate, from the day I got that zoning, the market began to improve. People were flocking to me. Everybody wanted to finance the job or join up as a partner. After getting my final approvals, a frenzy of calls came in from potential investors and partners. Some were legit, and some were not. One caller was a character named Daniele Bodini, who was at one time married to the granddaughter of the legendary Charlie Allen of Allen and Company. This guy worked with me for months, trying to figure out every aspect of the job. He would wheel and deal with my people, talk joint venture all over the place. He seemed to rev up to do a deal. I had heard nothing but terrible things about him, but really had no idea whether or not they were true. When you're doing deals and talking to many people, you want to try and keep an open mind, but you do want to keep your guard up, and I sure as hell did. I began hearing rumors that while he was talking to us in a most friendly way, he was, behind my back, negotiating with Chase Manhattan Bank and the others to try to buy my mortgage at a discount. Part of the mortgage was personally guaranteed, and I had no doubt, after hearing these rumors, that if he was able to get the mortgage, he would immediately foreclose on the project, call in my personal guarantee, and try to take total control. I didn't let on that I was wise to what he was doing. He would come in all roly-poly with big smiles, while at the same time I suspected he was working very hard to screw me big time. I informed the bank that if it went along with this guy's idea, it could have a major liability. Even the bank did not seem happy with Bodini's antics. In the end, the only thing he did was to force me to hurry up in making my financing and partnership deal. I didn't want to give this guy even the slightest opening. Despite all the offers, some of which were really quite compelling, I decided to go with the Hong Kong investors Henry Chang of the New World Development and Vincent Lowe. Both of these men have become great friends, having placed confidence in me at a time when others weren't so sure. I'll never forget one morning picking up the New York Times and reading a quote from Frankie Chang, who works with the group. When asked why these Hong Kong investors had backed the project, he simply stated, "We made this investment for one reason: Donald Trump." During the nasty and protracted zoning processes, my mortgage loan with Chase Manhattan Bank and its participants had gotten to be quite high, at one point in excess of $300 million. I had informed them that I would not be making interest payments. The investors in what is currently called Riverside South, the name will be changed, are among the most sophisticated in the world. They came into the city at a low moment, and together we bought the mortgage back for a huge discount from Chase Manhattan Bank. We went to Chase together and bought what could have been considered to be about a $320 million mortgage, including all costs, for $82 million. Had the bank stayed in, they would have gotten all the money back and then some, but fortunately for us, it was not their decision to do so. Therefore, not only do we have beautiful, pristine zoning, professional zoning on the finest large-scale piece of land in America, but we substantially reduced the cost I had accumulated over the years. The bank wanted the money, and I did not want to wait years to get it. I don't blame them. But if they'd waited, they would have cashed out high. Henry Chang and Vincent Lowe could feel it too. Despite being from the other side of the world, their great instincts, that's great instinct. They were willing to bet on me in New York City. Their bet has already paid off. We were under construction on almost $500 million worth of towers. My Hong Kong partners have always been enthusiastic and supportive of our partnership. I recently received the following note. Dear Donald, I note that we have saved more than $4.6 million in the subcontract awards for our first two buildings up to the last week. According to Ambrose and Paul, we couldn't have done so well without you taking charge and making the final award calls. Your knowledge and connection with the local subtrades are invaluable. Your personal involvement in this effort is much appreciated. Thank you very much. Best regards, Henry Chang. The West Side Railroad Yards is proving to be, after a long and tedious struggle, one of the greatest real estate deals ever. And as for my relationship with the civic groups, people who my advisors told me I should never even contemplate making a deal with, it certainly blossomed. Richard Kahn has left the UDC chairmanship in order to run for governor. He was replaced by a terrific and dynamic guy named Phil Howard, who wrote the bestseller, The Death of Common Sense. The collaboration has worked out so well that our contract with them expired. We extended it for another 10 years. They are terrific people that have had a great impact on this development, an impact that will be seen and felt by millions of people for many years to come. I want to conclude this chapter by describing a wonderful event that took place in 1995, right next to this project, the Nation's Day Parade. More than 1 million people participated and turned it into one of the biggest events in the history of New York City. I think it was a reaction to the Veterans Day Parade, which took place on Riverside South the year before, when our proud veterans marched up Riverside South into a virtual downpour. They could not have been a more unhappy lot. Fewer than 100 people had watched the parade. These are the guys who really had the guts. They protected our freedom during World War I World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Gulf War. No one cared, and no one watched. Traffic was out of control. Cars from side streets were driving right through the parade. Pedestrians didn't pay the slightest attention to our veterans. The debacle was widely reported in the front pages of the New York Daily News, the New York Post, and the New York Times. While few people watched the parade, many watched the aftermath. The following day, I received a call from our great mayor of New York City, Rudy Giuliani, asking me whether or not it would be possible to meet with a group of veterans who wanted to do it differently the following year. Rudy Giuliani has really done an amazing job as the mayor of New York, helping to make the city a hot place again. I told him that I would be glad to meet with all these veterans. A small delegation came in, headed by James K. Kallstrom, a tremendous guy, and the head of the New York City office of the FBI. Jim told me that the last Veterans Day parade was a complete disgrace, an embarrassment to the nation. They made it quite clear that day that they would like to do another parade. They asked me to lead it as the Grand Marshal. Essentially, they wanted my stamp of approval. They needed dollars. They knew I could raise lots of money and get additional donors. They also knew I would attract a lot of press. I agreed. I thought it would be fun, and I knew it was important. Mayor Giuliani was pledging the support of the city. I put up the money. Others matched it. I always knew there was a military out there, but I had no idea such high-quality people led it. This is something I got to know, and know very well. Over the next few months, one of these people in particular, Admiral Bill Owen, who sat on the Joint Chiefs of Staff as the head of the Navy, became a very close friend of mine. Bill was not only had that incredible look and demeanor, but he had a great level of intelligence and a winning attitude that I can match against any of the top business leaders in this country. But more on Bill and the Joint Chiefs of Staff later. At the City Hall press conference, it was becoming quite obvious to all that I and the others had done quite the job. The press was going absolutely crazy for the idea because they, too, knew that what a shame it was that the last Veterans Day parade had gone so badly. There were many reporters and great spirit among them, a kind of spirit I never knew the media had. It turned out that the media, too, was proud of our great military heritage, and in particular, our wonderful veterans. They could not have been more nicer or more respectful towards what they were doing. Huge television newscasts were done on what was to soon take place. The military committed to having thousands of soldiers attend the parade in March. Grandstands were being set, and almost everyone invited, from the top politicians in the United States to the heads of the armed services, and even, yes, many of my businessmen friends from New York promised to attend. It actually got to the point where a lot of my civilian friends, some of the biggest names in the country, were calling me and asking if they could march in the parade. I told them yes, providing that they would pay $10,000 each towards their effort. The morning of the parade turned out to be magical. The weather was perfect, and the parade started to form. Hours before parade time, it was obvious that millions of people would be attending. The New York City Police did an incredible job, but they were helped by the military themselves, Defense Secretary William Perry, Governor Pataki, Mayor Giuliani, Senator D'Amo, Senator Mohian, Lieutenant Governor Betsy Ross, and all the top generals and admirals came from all over the country, and indeed from all over the world, to attend this great parade. As we marched up Fifth Avenue, the people were lined up 10 and 15 deep for miles, and they were going quite wild. I was walking to the front row with the various people when Governor George Pataki, one of the greatest governors in New York State that they've ever had, pushed me forward and said, "Donald, you deserve to go out to the front of this parade all by yourself." I was embarrassed to do so, actually, but appreciated his gesture. We began the parade on 5th Avenue at about 50th Street and marched right by some of my buildings, including, of course, Trump Tower, which was packed to the rafters with people hanging out from all over it. The parade lasted all day, with huge numbers of soldiers and sailors and airmen proudly marching in formation until they arrived at 86th Street and 5th Avenue, and the end. Many actually circled back to watch the others march. It is estimated that at least 1.4 million people watched and showed up for that parade, as opposed to less than 100 people the year before. I was given all sorts of compliments, condemnations, and awards for what I did. But that was nothing compared to the friends I made and would make because of my involvement. It very much reminded me of what I did 10 years earlier with the Vietnam Veterans Day Parade, which also turned out to be a tremendous success. The difference was, while I was very much involved with the Vietnam Parade, I put up much of the money, over $1 million, to see that it was a success. I was not as front and center as I was with the Nation's Day Parade. I just felt that something had to be done after the disgrace of the year before. About a month after the parade had ended, and everybody was still feeling good, I received a call from Admiral Bill Owens, who asked if he could come to see me. When he arrived in my office, we shook hands and embraced, much as two soldiers would do after winning a battle. He told me he was representing the Joint Chiefs of Staff in a request that I go to Washington in the near future to have lunch with Secretary of Defense William Perry and the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff. He said this was something that was virtually never done before, that on occasion individual members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff would have lunch with someone, but almost never as a unit. In fact, he said that he could not even remember such an event ever taking place. The Joint Chiefs wanted to honor me for what I had done with the Nation's Day Parade. Naturally, I was very excited. I gave an immediate yes. When I arrived at the Pentagon, I was taken to what is called the War Room and informed that few civilians have ever been allowed to see this room. Pictures were taken of me, Secretary Perry, and the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff, and during lunch, presentations were made. I have never seen so many 3- and 4-star generals in my life, nor have I seen people who were more impressive, and I've seen people who are pretty impressive. As 1-star generals would come in to introduce a subject on how the country defends itself, I would say, "How come you're only a 1-star general?" One of the men I got to know during this session was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General John Shaliskyville. This is a powerful man, a man of great authority and bearing who, if I were casting a movie of what the Joint Chiefs of Staff should look like, I would choose him to play the lead. Each one of the people gathered in this room possessed tremendous bearing and strength, equal to or greater than those with whom I work with at the top levels of civilian life. I was a little surprised by this, to be honest, but boy did it turn out to be a pleasant experience. But we were making out our deals and having fun doing so. These guys kept keeping an eye on the world and the country. They gave me a preview of the world's hotspots, and each time I would say, "Gee, that sounds like a problem," they would look at me and smile with total assurance and explain that our country could easily be handled in case of a problem. With these guys and our military capability, anybody wanting to mess around with us would be in serious trouble. This is one of the first days where, from the moment I left New York, I totally turned off the phone. I did not want messages. I did not want anything from the outside world. I wanted to focus on what was going on. At the end of the day, I could not have been more impressed. It showed me a whole new dimension of the United States and what is going on to defend it. These are some of the greatest men I have ever had the privilege to meet, and they were thankful to me because I did something to highlight the men they most respect, the veterans. I now have the greatest admiration for the military, but far more important I know this country is being watched over by a brilliant and talented group. The next chapter will be called The Press and Other Germs.